evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Simrosa Art Gallery for this evening's talk. I've asked most of you, but maybe I'll do it once more for the latecomers. You can just show your hands. When we have these events in the fort area at the Prince of Wales, at the CSMVS, we start with tea at 5:30 and the lecture starts at 6. Because over the years we've seen that office goers don't want to waste that half an hour, they rather get home. It works well there. Now with a show of hands, just tell me, here we'll be serving tea at 6 and start the lecture at 6:30. Today was an unusual day. Everybody got here really fast because there's very little traffic, and now we have the C-Link. So with a show of hands, would you like to start at 6:30 for the next few lectures?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay, it looks like 6:30. So welcome this evening on behalf of Simrosa Art Gallery and the Museum Society of Bombay on a very, very interesting talk from Bengal to New York, two new Indian portraits at the Met. Dr. Eaker, Adam, and I have a common friend, Romita Ray, who is a professor at university in the US, sent me this message. You have to have this talk, and it has to be around these dates. So I said, yes, we would love to do it. We all like to know about new acquisitions, how they came about, why they came about, who painted them, when were they painted. And over the period of time, I've noticed that if you take a small subject like this and then expand it, you get more depth of knowledge in what you're learning. Please do come forward. Please, yes, I think you can even sit next to each other. So when we started this correspondence, and I didn't know why this date was so sacrosanct, but I've discovered that our speaker is off on a wonderful tour of India, visiting lovely places like Maheshwar and Bundi and Jaipur and Lucknow, and he starts at dawn tomorrow morning. So it had to be this date. And of course, Diwali was there for 2 days. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. A few words about what you're going to hear. It's a lecture that explores 2 portraits that have been recently acquired by the Met in New York, both depicting 18th century Indian women. The first, Joanna da Silva by William Wood, and she's there in all her glory on the screen, portrays an Indo-Portuguese, and he's really very cutely used the word Aya. I should have put it into inverted commas, but I think most of us know an Aya is a domestic female helper in the household who sat for her portrait in London way back in 1792. The second, painted in Calcutta in 1787 by the celebrated Anglo-Italian artist Francesco Renaldi, represents a yet unidentified elite Muslim woman and was exhibited as a portrait of a Mughal lady at London's Royal Academy in 1791. Dr. Eaker will take us through the history about the one sitter that we know and about its place in its contemporary world. Dr. Eaker is the Howard Marks Curator of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We all call it the Met, as indeed many New Yorkers do, where he is responsible for the collection of 16th to 18th century British art and Northern European painting. He studied art history at Yale and Columbia and received his PhD in 2016. There's wonderful articles and reviews on his career on the net, and I urge you to go and read more about our young scholar. And before I hand you over to him, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. At another museum which all of you are really invited to, and I urge you to go and see, the newly renovated F.D. Alpaiwala Museum, which is a museum devoted to Parsi Iranian Zoroastrian scholarship ranging from 3000 BC, from pre-Achaemenid and Achaemenid times, right up to China trade and Parsi entrepreneurs of the last century, given by the former chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission and the TIFR, Dr. Anil Kakodkar, and the subject is the late Dr. Homi Bhabha, the scientist, well-known and celebrated scientist, who died in the mid-60s in a tragic Air India plane crash. And Dr. Kakodkar will be speaking on Homi Bhabha because in the month of November, they always celebrate Dr. Bhabha's life and legacy. And that's on Thursday, the 30th of October, a week from now, at the Alpaiwala Museum. On Tuesday, the 11th, back again here at Simrosa, we are bringing back the Hazaribagh painters. They're tribal painters from Hazaribagh, doing extremely well now because they've taken their wall painting off the walls and they're bringing it into the art galleries again. The Khobar and the Khobar painters and the Sorai embroiderers of quilts, sujnis as we call them. And that show has been curated by Bulu Imam and his son Gustav. And please do come. It's on for about 10 days, commencing on Tuesday the 11th. And on the 12th, back again here, we're going to have a lecture by Martin Powell. He's the Dean of Arts at the University of Bristol. He's going to be speaking on print culture in the speeches of Richard Brinsley Sheridan and Warren Hastings and the Fourth Estate. They'll all be here at 6:30 on, I hope you'll all be here at 6:30 on Wednesday, the 12th of November. So without much ado, I'd like to hear more about the representation of South Asian sitters during the first century of British colonialism at the Met, now housed at the Met. Please join me in giving Adam Eaker a very warm round of applause, but before that, I would like to acknowledge the generosity of our member, Aarti Mehta, and her husband, Behram, who have supported this lecture very generously. This talk, which we have organized in memory of Behram's father, the late Naval Vakil, and Firoza Vakil, his sister. So thank you, Aarti and Behram. I know Aarti is here. So thank you and your family for doing this. And now a round of applause for Adam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Godrej, for that very warm welcome, and thank you all for coming. I know this is a holiday week, so I'm very touched to see such a great turnout, and really delighted to be talking about these portraits for the first time in Mumbai. This is actually my first visit to the city, and it's been a wonderful visit, and I know that I will be back soon. So, as you'll have heard from Dr. Godrej, my area of responsibility at the Met in New York is Northern European and British painting. And I really was hired to be a curator for artists like Rembrandt, Vermeer, Peter Paul Rubens. I would say that British painting at the Met has always been a bit in the shadows, certainly less celebrated than our collection of Dutch painting. A bit of a stepchild, you might say, of the collection. And because of that, British art has never been collected really systematically or from a scholarly approach at the museum. Instead, we do have wonderful British paintings, but they all came to us as bequests from New York collectors, and they really reflect the taste of New York collectors in the late 19th and early 20th century. So you see two major examples of that. Always very elegant portraits of aristocratic, or at least pseudo-aristocratic sitters. We have here an actress who became a countess, Miss Farron, and then a very dashing army officer on the right. So we're very grateful to have these portraits, but for me, as someone who is trained as an academic scholar of British art, they only allow us to tell a very limited story. And of course, one of the central aspects of British history in the 18th and 19th century is empire, is colonialism, and particularly the relationship to India. And even though we have a wonderful collection of Indian art that you may know at the museum, we didn't have anything in our collection of British paintings that in an obvious way allowed us to tell the story of British India, of the Raj, of British Empire. And so one of the goals that I set myself when I took on responsibility for the British paintings was to acquire at least one work that would allow us to start telling this story. New York, of course, is a city with a very large South Asian diaspora population, and it felt very urgent that we be able to expand our narrative that we tell about British art. And so I had spread the word among colleagues that I was looking for something along these lines, and I didn't know if it would be a landscape painting, a portrait, a scene from history, but I knew that I wanted something a bit perhaps like this Zoffany. It's a fantastic painting now at the Thyssen Museum in Madrid by an artist born in Germany but who worked primarily in England, who then traveled to India, and who is painting here the family of Sir Elijah Impey, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Calcutta. He's shown here with his wife and children, with their household. They're listening to a concert of Indian musicians. So it's a painting that allows you to tell a whole story about contact, about politics, about the Anglo-Indian domestic arena. So I knew it would be difficult to find something like this, but I kept my eyes peeled. And then in 2020, I was thrilled when a colleague of mine reached out to me about an upcoming estate sale, not being held at one of the major auction houses in New York, but at a small auction house upstate that handles a lot of estates from New York City collectors. And this colleague of mine had spotted one portrait in this collection depicting an Indo-Portuguese woman named Joana de Silva. The collection belonged to an art historian named John Richardson. He is famous for writing a 2-volume biography of Picasso that really was his whole life's work. He lived actually to be 100 years old, so had a very long, very interesting life. And he was also a collector. He was originally from the UK, and he was very interested in work from British India. You see that in this photo from the interior of his country house in Connecticut, where you see Joana de Silva hanging in situ in the context in which he displayed it. And so I just had a little time to Google. This was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, so I didn't even have access to a library, but I just entered a few keywords, and I started to realize that this was a very special, a very interesting painting, and potentially one where I could make some discoveries. So I took the train upstate to this auction house, went incognito, not wanting to draw attention to myself, and this is how the picture was displayed in the auction house. So you can see it's quite eclectic. There's a fair amount of bric-a-brac. It was next to the portrait of the cat, John Richardson's cat. But I could tell this was a really interesting painting. And I also thought that there was going to be a lot of competition at the auction. But fortunately, we were actually able to work directly with the estate of John Richardson to acquire it directly from them. And so the portrait came to the Met in 2020, so about 5 years ago. And it really, I could say without exaggeration, I think it changed my life because it sent me down a whole rabbit hole of research, eventually of travel here to India, and it introduced me to new friends, including Professor Romita Ray, who introduced me to Dr. Godrej. So it's the reason I'm here this evening. And it also forced me a bit to be a kind of art historical detective, to figure out what was the story of this mysterious woman. You see the portrait here pre-restoration, post-restoration. It had actually been rather heavily overpainted, so it needed extensive treatment in our conservation studio. And while that work was going on by my colleagues in conservation, I was doing my own work, my own sleuthing, so to speak. And one thing that really was a miracle about this portrait is if you look in the upper right-hand corner, it has an inscription. It tells us a number of clues, and I'll walk you through those clues for the next few minutes. All right, so here's the inscription. I'll read it in full. Joanna de Silva, a native of Bengal, the faithful and affectionate nurse of the children of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Deere, painted by William Wood, 1792. And I'll go through each of those key clues that this inscription contains one by one. So the first clue was the name of the sitter, the most important fact we can have. Joanna de Silva, a native of Bengal. And as you'll know, Joanna de Silva is a Portuguese name, so we knew right away that she was Indo-Portuguese or perhaps of Portuguese descent. And this is actually not so surprising in that many travelers to Calcutta in the 18th century reported that Indo-Portuguese women were preferred to take care of the children. They did not have dietary restrictions, they were Christian, and for this reason they were often preferred to be in this very intimate role of really raising the children for these British families. So here's a quote from one woman traveler, Jemima Kindersley. She said, "The servants who attend in a lady's apartment are generally slave girls or Portuguese women, and the nurses for children are Portuguese." So what we knew of her identity so far aligned with these travelers' reports. And I started then to also look up this name, Joanna de Silva, in different archives. And one of the first things that I found was that there was a will, a last will, dictated in Calcutta in 1809 by a woman named Joanna de Silva, spelled just slightly differently than in the portrait, with an H, but in this period, names get spelled all kinds of different ways. And I knew that she didn't know how to write because she signed the will with an X, but she was a fairly wealthy woman. She owned a house, she left substantial bequests of cash and jewelry, she had a number of servants. So I started to ask myself, could this woman, this rather wealthy woman in Calcutta in 1809, be the same woman who sat for her portrait in 1792? I also started to ask questions about what she's wearing in the portrait, particularly the jewelry. And some of you in this audience actually helped me with this question. The jewelry is very distinctive. It's been identified as Indo-Portuguese, perhaps Goan. Here's a somewhat close example. I haven't been able to find identical pieces, but clearly she was a woman of wealth. Also at the time the portrait was painted. Her identity as Indo-Portuguese is also confirmed by the jewelry she wears. And one thing that it took me a while to identify in particular was this pink piece of silk hanging from one of her necklaces. And it turns out this is a scapular. It's a Catholic devotional pendant. So again, giving us a sense of her identity. And from the last will that I found in the British Library, it was clear she was very devout. She left most of her estate to her confraternity. So again, we're getting different pieces of archival evidence reinforced by the visual evidence of the portrait. Now, the next clue was the name of her employer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Deere. And actually, there was a lot more to find out about him when I went into the archives. He was an officer in the army of the British East India Company, and he died in 1791 in battle against Mysore in one of the Anglo-Mysore wars. And he was struck by a cannonball, and this death was reported in many newspapers at the time. He was considered a very noble, heroic figure. And what was even more striking was that his wife, Catherine Deere, died in the same week. She had stayed home in Calcutta at Fort William, and according to these newspaper reports I found, she was so anxious about her husband that she actually died of anxiety. At least that's what was reported. And so she was described as a kind of tragic heroine. There was a monument that was constructed, an obelisk. Some of you may have been to the wonderful, very atmospheric Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta. That's where this monument is, built by Charles Russell Deere's brother, still stands today. I was able to visit it and take this photograph eventually. And so it made sense, it started to make sense to me that there was a connection between the deaths of this couple in the same week in 1791 and the fact that their children's nurse, Joanna de Silva, was painted in 1792. So I started to dig deeper, and I spent a lot of time in the archives in London, and I was eventually able to create this timeline, which I think explains a bit about why this very unique portrait was painted. So the key sequence of events here, you have the death of Catherine Deere, September 7th, 1790. 6 days later, her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Russell Deere, dies at the Battle of Sitimangalam. And then we know that the executors of their estate make a payment to Joanna de Silva in November to purchase clothes for Miss Deere's passage to Europe and for attending on Miss Sophia Deere on her passage to England. Sophia Deere was the 4-year-old daughter of this couple who was left an orphan, and she was sent back to England, where she had never been, but where her parents came from, where her surviving relatives were. And this was a 6-month sea voyage at the time. So it was clear that she couldn't travel by herself. And so Joanna de Silva was actually paid a very substantial sum of money, 600 rupees, to travel with her. And we know that their ship reached England on June 15th, 1791. I was able to find the actual ship's journal. And it's then in 1792 that she sits for her portrait in London. And so my theory is that this portrait commemorates the fact that she accompanied this orphaned 4-year-old child. She's described as the loyal and affectionate nurse, and her loyalty and affection manifested themselves in this sea voyage. Of course, the fact that she was also paid 600 rupees for this voyage could account for the fact that she ended her life a woman of property. It explains how she came to own a house and employ the servants that she did. And you also see that she has a very different stature in the portrait than we might associate with an ayah. Here's a detail from the Zoffany painting that's a more typical example of what we think of as an ayah. So clearly she had an unusual status, and many people who I've told about this portrait have wondered, was she perhaps actually the mother of Sophia Deere? We know there were examples where Indian women who had relationships with European men who had children would then pose as the ayah in order to be able to accompany their children to England. So it's all possible. I haven't found any evidence, but clearly there's an unusual story here. And then the final clue is the name of the artist, William Wood. Not a famous artist today, but someone who was quite successful primarily as a painter of portrait miniatures, working on ivory. And it seems that his clientele mostly came from the British East India Company. He worked for this network, even though he never left England himself. He painted, for example, this portrait of a Chinese servant whose name we unfortunately no longer know, but who worked for an East India officer. This is now in Stockholm. But Joana da Silva is his only known surviving oil painting, and he had studied at the Royal Academy. And in painting Joana da Silva, when he was just about 21 years old, he was clearly inspired by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Reynolds had painted this famous unfinished portrait of a black man, sometimes identified as Francis Barber, the servant of Samuel Johnson, but that's probably not accurate. And we know from William Wood's estate that he had copied this portrait, and clearly he's referring to the composition when he paints Joana da Silva as well. So, putting all these pieces together, the final part of my research was to actually travel to Calcutta to try to search for Joana da Silva. So I went to Park Street Cemetery and I found the obelisk to her employers and took this photograph. But what I really wanted to find was her own grave and to see if the grave would have any more information. In her last will, she said she wanted to be buried in the Catholic Church at Calcutta, as close to the high altar as possible. She died in 1809, and the church that is still the Cathedral of the Most Holy Rosary was built in 1790, so it would have been the same church. And I was able to make contact with the parish priest, Father Franklin Menezes, who was very welcoming to me, and I went to the church, and he even had the custodian take up all of the carpeting so we could look for the gravestones. So you see a picture there with the carpeting rolled up. Unfortunately, we were not successful. It was very tantalizing, but we didn't find any grave with her name on it. It was clear there had been a lot of renovation around the high altar. A lot of the grave markers were even sliced in two. So I'm still looking, but that was the one piece I wasn't able to locate, but still had many, many different points of connection. Eventually, I was able to weave all this together into an article for the Met's Journal, and if you're interested in reading more, you can download that for free from the Met's website. And happy to circulate the link later. The painting is now on view. I think it has become really a favorite among our visitors. I often see people stopped in their tracks, very curious about this woman and her story. And it, again, really lets us, I think, to look behind some of the fictions of British portraits. So we have many very idealized images of upper-class mothers and children. This is a moment in British culture when there's a real shift in how motherhood is perceived. Women are expected now, upper-class women, to be affectionate mothers, to be engaged mothers, in a way they really weren't expected to beforehand. And so you often see that role acted out in their portraits. For example, this is one portrait from our collection of Mrs. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the wife of the famous playwright and member of parliament. It sounds like you're going to get a lecture about him, so this is on topic. So this is a very wealthy, sophisticated city woman, but here we see her dressed up as though for a costume party as a rural laborer with her child on her back, going to gather water from a stream, something she never would have done. But she is acting out this role. And I think now having the image of Joana da Silva allows us to think about the different roles people played, who actually was raising children in wealthy British households, and to again tell a more complicated story than we were able to before. So I'm never satisfied with just one acquisition. So once we had Joana de Silva, I of course wanted to buy more portraits to expand this story further. It took a few years, but in 2023, I was thrilled when a colleague at Sotheby's let me know about this painting coming up for auction by the Anglo-Italian painter Francesco Renaldi. It's a very Italian name, but he was actually born in England and spent most of his life there, except for 10 years he spent in India. But a very rare artist. I think there are only maybe 8 paintings that survive from his time in India. And this was a work that had been in a private collection in the UK, really not studied, and became available. And I fell in love, and I felt we have to have it. And fortunately, I think the impact that Joana de Silva had in our galleries convinced my superiors at the museum that we would make a valiant effort to bid at auction on this painting. Let's see if I can get the next slide. All right, seem to be frozen. Yeah, it's there. There we go. And so one of the things that we do when we try to make an acquisition is we really need to understand the condition. And with Joana de Silva, it was a very short train ride away. But in this case, I actually had to travel to London with a conservator and went to look at the portrait. Sotheby's very kindly set it up for us. You see here a photo I took looking at it with the infrared light. And fortunately, it was in wonderful condition. And so we got the green light from the conservator to bid. I don't know if I point it there. And we also fortunately had some money at our disposal. One thing that we do at the Met very regularly, which is different from many museums, is that we deaccession, meaning that we sell works from the collection. And that happens when a work has been in storage for a long time. It's maybe not the best example of work by a given artist. In this case, we had deaccessioned a group of British portraits at Sotheby's. And our rule is that we only deaccession to then acquire. So we would never use those funds to pay our electricity bill, for example. We would only use it to acquire and something in the same category. So we had this pot of money that we needed to use on a British portrait. And so fortunately, we were able to apply that and then to be successful at auction. And the painting came. It was in very good condition, except that the varnish was quite yellow, quite discolored. And so our painting's conservator, Dorothy Mann, very carefully cleaned it. You can see, if you look at her arm, there's this line where it's been partially cleaned, so the darker area is where you still have the old varnish, and then you have the cleaned portion next to it. And then after this treatment, the painting went on view, and that's always a really, really exciting day when a new acquisition goes on view. And now I'm really sort of in the midst of that process of detective work that I described with Joana de Silva, of trying to tell this woman's story. So unfortunately, the inscription doesn't give us a name. It's a less informative inscription. It tells us the artist's name, Francesco Renaldi. It tells us it was painted in Calcutta and painted in 1787. So that's a good bit of information, but I really want to know who was this woman. One thing we do know is that the painting was exhibited in 1791, and it was described at that time as portrait of a Mughal lady, and it also was copied. One copy was made by Francesco Renaldi himself. And you can see he's embellished it a little. He's added hookah, he's added a perfume sprinkler, and then this copy was itself copied. He seems to have taken the painting with him to Lucknow, where I myself am traveling tomorrow. And it was copied there by a Lucknowi artist. You see this work now in a private collection, and there are multiple images. So it had an afterlife, and it seems to have appealed also to an Indian audience. But when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, there was a very interesting review of it written that I found in the scrapbook in the Royal Academy archives. And one thing that is very clear from this review is that this critic saw this as the portrait of a real woman. Some people have said this is a generic image, it's a fantasy of an Indian woman, or maybe a fantasy of a courtesan. But this critic, who saw it just a few years after it was painted, felt sure that it was a real woman, and he even speculated that she might have been the mistress of Governor Hastings. So, very interesting theory, probably just his fantasy, but it gives us the idea that this probably is a real portrait, and there is a name for us to discover. So I'm still working on that. There are different theories. As you may know, a woman of the stature indicated by the jewelry probably would have been in purdah at this time, would not have sat for her portrait by a European artist unless she was married to a European or in a relationship with a European. So if we think about women from elite Muslim backgrounds who were in Calcutta in 1787 who were married to European men, it's not such a long list. So there are some candidates, but I don't have that smoking gun yet. If you have any ideas, very, very happy to hear them. Certainly there's a lot that we can learn based on the jewelry that she's wearing. I've heard some very different theories about where this jewelry comes from and what it tells us. So I welcome, again, any suggestions, any insights from you. And just to wrap up, my next steps are to try to identify this sitter or to come up with as plausible a hypothesis as I can about who she might be, and then to think about what sort of exhibition will give us a context for these two portraits together. These are both portraits of women who lived in Calcutta, who had their portraits painted by European men, but who came from wildly different backgrounds, wildly different status, cultural identities, probably language. And so how do we bring them together, and what works can we surround them with in a temporary exhibition that will tell this history that may not be familiar to our New York audience, but I think is a really important story for us at the Met to tell. So that's one thing I'm here in India to think about, to research, and to focus on. And I'm so delighted to be here, and I would really welcome any questions or comments that you might have. So thank you so much for your attention.